I have just come from a place that considers itself very much the core in America to Britain, which once certainly considered itself the core in global events. And not so long ago, I was being interviewed in mock interviews by young children in Brooklyn who were asked to read the first chapter of my book, and then they had to interview me about growing up. And one of them asked me, was it difficult for you growing up in England with an accent? And I stopped for a while and I said, well, I didn't have, well, everybody had my accent. And you could see the ticking of relativity going on in his mind. And in a way that's as good a place as any to kind of frame this discussion. I want to start with what I'm going to call a tale of two white girls. One is Sandra Laing from Mpumalanga in South Africa, and the other is Bliss Broyard, who was raised in the blue bud world of Connecticut's twee suburbs and private schools. Now, Bliss Broyard's racial identity was ensconced in the comfort of an insular whiteness that had always known there were others, but had never really considered them. I'd never had a conversation about race, she confesses in her book, One Drop. In the world I was raised in, it was considered an impolite subject. Although I grew up within an hour's drive of three of the poorest black communities in the US, those neighborhoods seemed as distant as a foreign country. But in early adulthood, Broyard would discover that on one level she had a greater connection to those neighborhoods than she imagined. For on his deathbed, her father, Anatoly, confessed that he was, in fact, a black man who had been passing as white throughout most of his life. Initially, she was thrilled at the news. It was, she wrote, as though I'd been reading a fascinating history book and then discovered my own name in the index. I felt like I mattered in a way that I hadn't before. But then came the heavy lifting. The family her father had left behind, many of whom lived in the South, and her relationship to those poor black communities that she had known of, but never actually known, forced her to reassess everything she had once thought about herself. I felt unsettled. I'd already experimented with describing myself as black on a few occasions, and it hadn't gone over well. The other white girl, Sandra Laing, was born to two white apartheid-supporting Afrikaner parents in a small town of Piet Retief, near the Swazi border. Her grandparents were also white. Blood tests proved that she was her father's daughter, yet Sandra emerged dark-skinned with afro hair, a black girl. And under the strict segregationist laws of apartheid, the fact that she had two white parents could only mean so much. Sandra was removed from her whites-only school and reclassified as coloured. Her parents fought the reclassification hard. Sandra has been brought up as a white, her father explained. She's darker than we are, but in every way she has also been a white person. If her appearance is due to some coloured blood in either of us, then it must be very far back among our forebears, and neither of us is aware of it. If this is in fact so, does it make our family any different from so many others in South Africa? Eventually, Sandra would be reclassified as white, but in a country where segregation was rigid and no one accepted her as white, this legalistic change was more than a technicality, but less than an objective reality. Eventually decided that since black people were prepared to accept her literally on face value while whites were not, that she would reclassify herself again, back to coloured. So, two white girls in two nations, founded in no small part on racial classification and segregation, discover that they are both in different ways black. Now, these, we might broadly agree, are two marginal tales. In all likelihood, we know relatively few people who have these racial experiences. But for the purposes of this contribution, and I would argue this conference, they're instructive because they shine considerable light on how the relationship between the margins and the core is understood, misunderstood, assumed, accepted, and all too often unacknowledged. Now, there are four specific ways in which this plays out in society in general that are illustrated here and that I want to dwell on for the rest of this talk. First, that the margins, in no small part, define the core. They establish the boundaries within which the core can be understood. Without the margins, there can be no core. Just as without borders, there can be no nation. The two concepts are not only inextricably linked, they are logically symbiotic. A lot was riding on Sandra Laing's classification. Far from being a personal matter, her race became an affair of state. If she's white, then who isn't? If she's black, whose family could be next? In a system founded on racial separation, there has to be some clear distinction about where one race starts and another one ends. Without it, the entire social fabric starts to fray. And these distinctions, by definition, always take place at the margins. Secondly, the categories that we are working with when we talk about what constitutes the marginal as opposed to the core are almost never definite or often even definable. Both of these girls are both white and black. In ordinary conversation, we assume that we know what these terms mean, but since race has no basis in biology, genealogy, science, or performance, we really don't. As soon as we start to define most of these terms that we commonly use in identity and culture, things rapidly fall apart. South Africa's Population Registration Act in 1950 defines a white person as any person who in appearance obviously is or who is generally accepted as a white person, other than a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a coloured person. Far from being watertight, these definitions are in fact incredibly porous. So while we have to work with the categories that exist, we should never be under the illusion that those categories are not open to challenge or based on logic. Third, that what is categorized as marginal and what is understood to be core has at its root nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with power. There is a reason why Bliss Broyard's father decided to cross the colour line, or why the Laings wanted Sandra to remain on their side of it. The lines in question divided society into a life with or without resources, privilege and power. Decisions are made at the core, consequences are felt at the margins. And en route from the margins to the mainstream are many gatekeepers, some official, others self-appointed, keen to stamp their imprimatur of authenticity and exact a price for entry. Oftentimes, that line may even be determined in court, and somebody has to draw it. All too often, what we insist is marginal has in effect simply been marginalized. And fourth and finally, that the relationship between the margins and the core is never settled and in constant flux. The categories we work with are not only not watertight, they are positively fluid. Identities and cultures are in a state of constant evolution, both within themselves and in relation to other things. They change not just as a result of time and tide, but as a result of struggles either within the margins and the core, between the margins and the core, and usually both. In a post-apartheid South Africa, Sandra Laing could have harnessed her racial identity for affirmative action, while Anatoly Broyard, who was raised in a segregated South, ran away from his blackness. His daughter, in a post-civil rights and Obama-led America, could run towards it. What's marginal today could well be core tomorrow, and vice versa. Now, the manner in which the core is defined by the margins, my first point, is best illustrated by recent events in Israel, where more than 40,000 people were recently told they were no longer Jewish with the stroke of a pen. The story starts on the margins. In 2008, a woman known as Rachel, an immigrant who had been converted by Chaim Druckmann, went to file for divorce. The rabbinical judge asked her a few questions about her conversion and, evidently unimpressed, then probed her on observance. Left with the impression that she did not observe the Sabbath or otherwise meet the standards he believed worthy of a Jewish convert, he ruled her conversion invalid. This also meant her marriage of the last 15 years had never been valid and that her children were no longer Jewish. Rachel had been converted by Rabbi Chaim Druckmann, who became the head of the Israeli Conversion Court. And when a three-judge panel heard her appeal, they decided not only to uphold her disqualification, but to disqualify all the conversions performed by Druckmann since 1999. In one fell swoop, 40,000 people were told, who thought they were Jewish, were told they were no longer Jewish. Now, this is no small thing. It brings us to the core. Israel is a Jewish state, and that's not an incidental description, but Israel's deliberate intention. The express aim of its political class and popular culture is to keep it that way. So the question of who is deemed to be Jewish